Okay guys, I'm just going to talk you through both the work that we need for the last two exercises, so that's F and G. F is linked to floats or slack, and G is the Gantt diagrams or Gantt charts. So this follows on nicely from what we were talking about in the previous lesson about critical paths and critical activities. If an activity isn't critical, then it will automatically have some float. Now that's going to be really important for our A2 work, because in A2 we will be we'll have extra kind of elements added to the question. For example, the number of workers it requires to complete an activity. And what we'll have to do quite often is find the most efficient way and the cheapest way to get a project completed using the minimum number of staff quite often as possible without delaying the project. So it's useful to know where the slack is, where the floats can be in order to distribute the workers sensibly to reduce the time, or not the time it takes, but the amount of workers we would need at any one time. So I've got the example that we looked at during Monday's lesson here, and just as a bit of a recap, we've got activity C. If we have a look at activity C, it has to start as early as, well, it can start as early as time 4 and must be finished by time 8, which gives it a bit of slack. So I've redrawn activity C here, and we can find the slack or the float by subtracting from the late time, so from the 8, we can subtract the time it takes to complete the activity and the early time of the activity, and that will give us the amount of float that the activity has. So in this case, that is a 1 hour or 1 unit of time float. Now we can also show floats on these Gantt charts or Gantt diagrams. They're sometimes called cascade diagrams if you have a look at the old course. So if you see in old exam papers them talking about cascade diagrams or cascade charts, these are the same thing. And what a Gantt diagram, what a full Gantt diagram does, is it shows the float or lack of float for all activities. And that will be really helpful when we come to looking at distributing our workers effectively. So we've done this in the lesson on Monday already, but to show it in a Gantt diagram, what we will do is we will start at the early time, so the 4. We will show the length of time that the activity takes. And then what we do is we show in a dashed box any float that's available. Why is that not shown as dashed? Let's try that again. Oh, it's because it's a box. Okay, so that's how we would show our float in this case, and you would write inside the box, you would just say that that's activity C. You could put 3 hours as well, just to make that super clear. But that would show C's float or C's section of the Gantt diagram. And obviously we're not going to be asked to do that for just one activity. We're going to have to do that for full activity networks. So I've got an example of a Gantt diagram involving float coming up next. We will always start with the critical path. So the first job when you're drawing a Gantt diagram is to find the critical path, because that will go at the top of your diagram one after the other. Okay, they won't go one underneath each other like the other activities will, but I'll show you what I mean as we go through this example. So we're going to draw the full Gantt diagram for this example on the board or on the screen. We're going to start off by, and again, you can pause this and if you want to do it yourselves before watching me do it, or you can just watch the whole thing and then kind of copy out the notes and stuff. It's up to you how you use this video. So first job is to identify the critical activities. So in this case, A is a critical activity, B is a critical activity, D is a critical activity, G is a critical activity, and actually in this case, so is H. So we actually have two critical paths here, and I'll show you how we deal with that shortly. So once we've identified our critical path, we are then going to draw our rectangles for each of the critical activities. So A will go first. A has no slack. So activity A has to start at time 0 and has to be completed by time 4 so that the project is not delayed. We then follow on with activity B. B takes 5 hours and has to be finished by time 9. And then you've got a couple of choices. You can either then follow that with activity D or activity H. It doesn't matter. There are two versions of this. I'm going to go with D and then G. So D takes 2 hours and G takes 3. Or units of time. And then I would draw H next. Now I would draw H up with the other critical activities, even though it doesn't kind of follow the rest of the pattern that we're going to see. And that's fine. So I'm going to put H has to start at time 9 and has to finish by time 14. So I'm going to put activity H here. Again, with no slack. And it's important to realise from this diagram that you could go straight from A to B to H, and that H is a critical activity and could contribute to a critical path. Once we've dealt with all our critical activities, we then go back to the other activities. We've already seen how to deal with C, so let's get C onto our diagram. C can start as early as time 4 and takes 3 hours to complete, but C also has got some float. It's got an hour of float that can go at the end. So activity C can go there. The next activity I'm going to look at is E. E has an early time of 7, but can be finished as late as time 9. So E can start at time 7. I just need to go back to solid lines. It takes 1 hour, but can be finished as late as time 9. So E also has 1 hour of slack or float. Oops. So there's E going in there. We've got H and F to do. I'm going to do F next because it starts earlier than H does, and it's just easy to see that happening. So F also can start at time 7. And F takes 4 hours, so 1, 2, 3, 4. However, can be finished as late as time 14, so F has 3 hours of slack or float. And we've already dealt with H, in fact. H was a critical activity, so H is up here. You could, and it doesn't really matter if you do this or you don't, but I tend to put H or extra critical activities near the top so I don't forget about them. I'm just going to lock that in place because I keep picking it up by accident. So the other option you could do for this diagram is to switch these around, is to have H down at the bottom, kind of following the alphabetical order, and and C, E and F up there. But I think that would be harder to remember that H is a critical activity. But I think you would get marked full marks either way for these. It's just your preference really. So that's a full example of a Gantt diagram or a Gantt chart, sometimes called a cascade chart. Once we've got a Gantt chart finished, the other thing we can be asked to do is use a Gantt diagram or Gantt chart to look at when activities have to be going on at particular times. So I've got a new Gantt diagram at the bottom of this page. I just want you to have a look at. I have just taken this from the textbook, so if it's a bit clearer in the textbook, it's one of the examples. You might want to use the textbook version instead. Now, what's really important to realise is that as soon as we start at time 0, and these are days, so day 1 is here. So this is midnight on day 1, even though it starts with a 0. This is midnight on day 2, midnight on day 3, and so on. So the question that's being asked this time is for us to determine 3 activities that must be happening at midnight on day 10. Okay, so we've got to work out where day 10 is. If this is midnight on day 1, day 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, midday on day 10 will be during this line here. So if I draw a line straight down, we will be able to see the potential activities happening during that time. Okay, anything that doesn't have slack must be going on during that period. So C is definitely an activity that must be happening at midday on day 10. And then we need to look at the float of the other 3 activities to determine whether they have to be happening or whether they could just maybe be happening, depending on how we want to split our workers. And it all depends on the amount of slack we've got. So D has 3 hours of slack. So D could start as late as midnight on day 10. So D must also be happening. I can't slide this. If you imagine sliding the solid rectangle up, I'm not going to slide it past the red line that I've drawn on. So D must be happening. So must E, because E only has 1 hour of slack. So E could be slid up 1 hour. But if I slid E up 1 hour, that would still be covering my red line that I've got going down the page. So E must also be happening. So C, D and E are the 3 activities that must be happening at midday on day 10. However, if we look at F, F might be happening on day 10, but isn't necessarily. Because if we take F's rectangle, if I copy F's rectangle, and slide that across to using the most amount of slack as possible, F doesn't necessarily have to start. The latest F can start is at midnight on day 14. So F doesn't have to be happening at this point if we want to use the workers that we've got, for example, to be getting on with C, D and E. So we could we could reduce the number of workers that we're using during this time, and that will save us money if this was a real life situation. So F might be happening and could be happening on day 10, but it doesn't have to be. Okay, that's actually all you need to know and be able to do to get through exercises E and F. Okay, and I think we can also do G. So I think, is it E and F or is it F and G? Let me just flick back the pages. So float is E. Introduction to Gantt charts is F. And G as well we can do, in fact. We can do all of E, F and G. That starts on page 240. Now, I know that sounds like a lot of work, but actually they're very quick questions to do. E is just about float without using Gantt charts. F is the introduction to Gantt charts, so drawing Gantt charts. And G is looking at what we just did in that last example, looking at what activities might be going on at particular times and what have to be going on at particular times. Okay. As I said in the lesson on Monday, just send me an email if you've got any problems, if you're not sure about anything, and I will get straight back to you. Have a lovely half term, and I will see you in a couple of weeks' time.